So it's a great honor to be here amongst colleagues in Cornell. I thank the organizers for inviting me to this both emotional, personal, but also professional event. I have met Professor Erik Torbeck in 1996 when the African Economic Research Consortium just launched the collaborative research on poverty. And at the time, I had read a lot on poverty economics. I was hired as a research assistant for a gentleman in the United Nations for Economic Commission. So I knew at that time what it meant, FGT, very, very deeply. So I almost got heart attack when someone said, "This is Erik Torbeck." My goodness, I said. So for me, what started as a surprise continued to this day. Professor Erik has been very supportive, and also, whether I deserve it or not, I don't know. He has had a lot of trust in my professional capacity. And always to maintain that trust it has been also partly a challenge, but partly also what keeps me going. He has been my examiner on my PhD thesis. Those of you who started late in life, don't give up. I'm a very good example of late bloomer. I did my PhD when most of my teachers were younger than me in the graduate school. So, but then it was a great ride. And fortunately for me also, Professor Erik Torbeck was the examiner of my professor in where I did my PhD. So there is some providence there, you could see it in all this scheme of things. So I have really, when I got the invitation, I said, what am I going to say to this wonderful event? What happened was in 1996 when we came to the ARC from Ethiopia, just fresh. The country was also just opening up. So for most of us who were participating in this kind of event, life was just starting from a very brutal regime. That was a very dark time for most of us. So whatever chance we got, we took it, and it was very helpful. As a result, at the time, we had a very unique data set that nobody had, a panel data. So every time we came to the ARC, we used to heads up, Every time somebody mentioned you have a problem of this, that, we just said, no, we control for this because we have panel. We could do dynamic analysis, etc. So that helped. What started in 1994 currently ended up in 2009. So I said maybe it's fitting to honor Professor Erik to just update this longitudinal data and talk about poverty dynamics in Ethiopia, which also he has been following this data set very, very closely. As some of you know, or most of you know, Ethiopia just emerged from a long and protracted civil war in 1992. And 2 years following that, we started collecting, it looks like it's stuck. Okay, I think, so the country just emerged out of conflict. And then, coincidentally, we started also collecting what we call the household data. Over this 15 or 20 years, Ethiopia has done very well. Some of you who follow growth rates in Africa, Ethiopia presumably is one of the fastest growing economies, particularly the last decade. So the question I'm trying to answer in this is to what extent this growth has been translated into meaningful reduction in poverty, and what is the situation about those people we have followed for a very long time in terms of all of these factors. The country has been growing at 4.42 per capita level for almost 2 decades. This would really mean, if you think of it, GDP should have doubled during this period, except for some volatility. This is, for instance, the official figure on growth in per capita GDP. It's been accelerating, and the country is doing wonderfully. This is what you got. And official figures also say poverty declined from 44% in 1995 to 30% in 2011. This is also a decent achievement. Now the question is, if you have a data set like ours, what is the story? Because this one, we got it from the official numbers. But what I'm presenting is based on the survey conducted by the Addis Ababa University in collaboration with Oxford University. This is a popular data set. It started in 1989, 300 households in 6 drought-stricken villages. That was data collected by IFPRI. So the same households were visited in 1994, but the sample size was expanded to 15 villages to constitute 1,500 households. And this wave of collecting data continued until 2009. The villages are spread out throughout Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a big country, about 80 to 85 million. Nobody knows today what the number is. It could be 90 million. But from the north all the way to the south and west and east part of the country, these villages which we have been collecting data are spread out. They represent also the major agroecological zones and the types of crops that are cultivated. Given also the homogeneity of many of the activities in rural areas, this seems to be fairly representative of what is happening in the country. The panel, the ones in my data file, the clean data, is about 1,400 households. Very low attrition in terms of sample, about 9%, and extensive in its coverage of living standards. So it could be considered one of the few data sets you could have in Africa. When I try to track growth in per capita consumption expenditure by households during this period with what the government also published on agricultural value added, doing a bit of filtering, it's they track more or less with a correlation about 50%. Now the question we want to answer is what's happening to poverty to these people we have been following over these years and the dynamics of it. Poverty is measured in a standard way. These days it's almost a cookbook. You have if you want to do poverty analysis, you don't need to go through what I have gone through to read all those things. You just know how FGT is constructed. The poverty line, 2,400 calories per day per person, and then we adjusted for non-food consumption. And then we used surveys in all rounds on prices, and then the usual very, very painstaking process of constructing the poverty line has been done. And for this presentation, I can tell you the last 1 month in updating this 2009 file, I've been almost up like a PhD student, almost until midnight and beyond. But finally, I got some story for you. The poverty line trend seems to be consistent with the inflation rate in the country. Since 2004, inflation almost in Ethiopia was increasing at a rate of 30–40%. We can talk about it, what went wrong, etc., but it was just a sudden shock throughout the economy. So it reflects on the trends in the poverty line. The one you have here is the BIR, the local currency units, and you could see how dramatic this increases. Extreme poverty during this period declined quite as the official figures show, but the difference is that the pace at which it was declining is very, very slow, 0.3% per year. Particularly when you want to look at the poverty conditions only 10% during the 15 years that these households have been covered escaped extreme poverty. Nearly 90% of them experienced it at least once in their lifetime, in our measure, poverty. So this is a very pervasive living condition. And especially when you look at the people who experience it 2 times or 3 times, this is close to 40, if you add this, almost more than 30%. If you add, like for instance, once, twice, thrice, 4 times, almost the majority has gone through this experience of poverty. The spells, that means then I tried to look at the, just not the experiences of poverty incidents, but also uninterrupted poverty, saying 1 times, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, and 5 times. And you can see almost 64% had at least 1 spell in poverty. If you add these 2, more than 80% of the people had at least 2 consecutive or 1 experience in poverty. So I try to look at the hazard rates, something that is, say, if you fall into poverty, what is the chance of you escaping it? In the context we are discussing, first-time experience of falling in poverty is not good. You have only 38% chance of exiting it. And consequently, if you fall into it again, second time, your chance declines. But however, you see some non-linearity. You know, we have followed these people for 15 years. So nobody got stuck in big numbers in that state of poverty, but somehow people climb out of it, but it takes long, long years. So the story is, if someone, for instance, had 5 rounds of continuous poverty, the chance that they would get out is about 75%. So the point I'm trying to say is the longer a person persists in poverty, at some point they will have a chance to get out of it. Otherwise they will die or something will happen, because the amount you have, this poverty line we are talking is a very, very, very small amount in terms of food content. If you continue to eat that for a very, very long time, probably something drastic can happen. So what potentially explains this poverty persistence? There is a story here, poverty may be propagating itself. This is a kind of true state dependence in the evolution of poverty. If you are pushed once into that condition, then it will have its own self-sustaining process, a kind of poverty trap. So I did something most people do, the dynamic probability specification on the evolution of poverty. Did a bit also to control for effects of initial conditions with unobserved factors in the setup of the random effects. What we have is lagged poverty status continues to matter to current poverty status. Even in the long years that we have, 15 years, normally it should disappear, at least in my view, if poverty is really inherently transient. If it's not, then even after 15 years of being observed and it persists, there is a potential for one, if people have fallen into it, it will take longer time to get out of it. And the initial condition here also matters. In the setup, initial poverty status is strongly related with the probability of falling into poverty in any period. Of course, we have control for other factors as well. What I tried to do is just separate the sample into 2 and see if this state dependence either has been the same between 2 periods, or has it declined, or has it increased, just to see whether the country's progress in the last few years is making things easier for people. The result is not so much different, except that, of course, in the later parts of the 2000, the state dependence coefficient declined slightly. If this is statistically significant or not, I have not tested it, but it appears from my experience in urban areas, which I did similar thing and then did the test. The difference is large enough to warrant and to say that the state dependence coefficient has declined a bit. Initial poverty status in the latter part of the 2000 didn't matter much. Actually, it's not even significant. So probably there has been some progress in the later years of in latter years. Now, the one thing I try to look at is if there is a poverty trap in the whole, in this sample that we are investigating. One way to document it is look at the current consumption as a function of its lag. This also gives you an opportunity to look nonlinear relations between the two. There are some papers some time back, I think Rebellion and a few others, who have tried to look at what they call empirical poverty traps. You may not have a theory why it is happening, but at least you can test it empirically. If once a person experiences shocks, then the chance that to recover from that shocks may not be easy. So in the Ethiopian sample, this non-convexity seems to be something that needs to be investigated. As you can see, there is a possibility that some households, especially if they face large size of shock, they may be pushed back into permanent poverty for a long time. This, even when you look at the entire scatter diagram, seems to suggest there is some level of low per capita consumption equilibrium. I did these parameter estimates, and what I found was for individual, a typical Ethiopian in this particular sample, if they face some sort of shocks, they might recover after a long time. Even the time it takes is long. But then they come back to a low level of equilibrium, very close to the poverty line, not far away. So this, to me, tells me that there is something deep and structural that is not changing in those 15 villages we have studied. Whatever the government has been doing, I mean, the government has done a lot. I mean, we can read that the government invested on fertilizer subsidies, seed subsidies. They have done a lot to improve land productivity, marketing, and all this, some of it which you have heard. So the point I'm trying to make is there is some tendency of a poverty trap. The other part I wanted to look at here is, okay, so we have a persistent poverty caused by several maybe structural factors, which I am not able to do yet here. But I wanted to look at also what is the role of inequality in this whole scheme. It seems that inequality is playing some important role, particularly the initial level inequality. So villages which started out very high level of inequality tend to experience low growth in the last 15 years. I mean, this tells me at least inequality is not trivial. It has some role to play. Therefore, I try to look at what determines or what drives inequality in Ethiopia. By the way, the Gini coefficient that we compute for all of these villages over these 15 years is not small number. It's in the range of 40 to 50%. So for a very low income country, mostly undifferentiated livelihood. That means everybody is more or less the same as everybody else. The Gini coefficient seems to be, even when you reduce the effects of extreme values, is still high. So one of the factors is the land issue. Again, Ethiopia has, land is owned by the government. No one owns land. So it's more or less a heritage of previous regime. But it's surprising why land is even playing a role in inequality, because everybody is supposed to have equal plots, because that's the rule. The government has allocation rule. You cannot buy, you cannot sell. Every part of the country you are allotted by some rules like family size, etc. So the size of land holding, the more fragmented it is, the lower inequality. The higher land inequality, the higher income inequality, but also education has some role to play. So with this, I just end my remarks by saying things have not gotten worse nor better for these households in Ethiopia despite this rapid growth, because I want you to keep in your mind that growth has not been small in Ethiopia, at least as reported by the government. Probably, Andy, I was not here. You may have had something on Ethiopia. So obviously, the agricultural growth rate is also large. But what we observe here is that poverty is persistent. It has declined, but declined quite small. So it's important to see what is going on and to understand the underlying causes. Thank you for your attention. I hope I haven't taken